Hello, my name is Michael Gilly, and today I will be discussing Che Guevara's book, Guerrilla Warfare. This book, which is very important to Latin American culture, was first published in 1961. Che Guevara was born on May 14, 1928, in Argentina. As a medical student, Guevara took a tour around Latin America and he kept a diary of his travels. This diary was later published as the Motorcycle Diaries. In his journeys, he saw social inequality and poverty that Guevara cared deeply for. After President Jacob Arbenz was exiled from Guatemala due to United States intervention, he met Fidel Castro and joined the movement to overthrow General Batista of Cuba. In the movement, Guevara quickly rose to second in command, and he started to take note of the tactics used by fighters, and began to implement some of his own design. Later, he wrote a book describing these tactics. The book, Guerrilla Warfare, is full of detail. Guevara wants to discuss with the audience what it means to be a guerrilla fighter. I don't mean that he covers the basics and he moves on. He covers every aspect from the mental focus to the physical attributes needed to be a true guerrilla fighter. He lets the reader know where they can find food, how to preserve ammunition, and what to do if you capture an enemy. Guerrilla Warfare was originally published shortly before Guevara's death. I bought the original edition by Guevara for my Amazon Kindle e-reader, but other editions do exist that may contain an introduction or an afterword to help the reader better understand the context of the book. The original edition does contain an epilogue, but that is used for Guevara's analysis of the future of Cuba. Guevara seems to give rules to fighters, but he only explains them briefly. The book starts off by covering the definition, tactics, and locations of skirmishes. He dedicates separate sections to fighting in friendly territory and fighting behind enemy lines. Guevara gives vastly different instructions on what to do in each scenario. For example, he explains that while you may have plenty of ammunition in friendly territory, you may find yourself low while fighting the enemy on their own ground. In this case, he suggests that no deceased man should be left with ammunition and other supplies after they are killed by the enemy. He continues by defining what the essence of a guerrilla fighter is. He states, guerrilla warfare is used by the side that is supported by a majority, to indicate that for the fighting to be justified, a group needs to be representative of the majority population. A guerrilla group for the minority might not receive little, if any, help at all from the community. He also felt that fighting should not disturb any civilian infrastructure, and he provides that there be strict rules for the guerrilla fighters. Guevara advises that villages should not be destroyed, as that would destroy homes of innocent people, but that power or water lines could be cut in order to derail society momentarily. The next chapter of the book covers the trials and tribulations that a guerrilla fighter can go through. He calls the fighter a social reformer and a combatant. While he mentions that real social change does not happen overnight, he advises that excess land and livestock should be distributed among the people. At the same time, Guevara says that captured men should be released unless they pose a grave danger to the guerrilla fighters or to the community. The final chapter covers how a guerrilla group should be organized. He speaks on small groups and large groups. Guevara is able to account for how food should be given out, and he assumes in this chapter that the group has gotten so large that they need to have an organization consisting of a leadership group, such as they had in Cuba. This is almost contradictory to his earlier stance that most guerrilla groups are small, but it does well to explain what should happen if that group does become too large. Later, he speaks on implementing penal codes, sabotage against other groups, the roles of women, and the distribution of propaganda, among other ideas. Guevara, as generic as it sounds, wrote the book on the subject. He does well to capture the image of a guerrilla fighter and project it into your mind. Guevara wants you to know that these fighters aren't fighting for themselves, they're fighting for communities. He applies strict rules to these fighters to never disturb the property of the locals unless completely necessary. He wants to realize that the guerrilla fighter is a social warrior as well. Guevara wasn't out to change the opinion of others, but he wanted to inform those willing to rise up against their governments a way to do so. He wanted to give the tools of insurgency to the people so that they may be able to live under a less oppressive government. After it was published, there were guerrilla uprisings all over Latin America, including Argentina and Peru, which were able to overthrow the governments in those countries. These changes were done because of what Guevara and others were able to accomplish in Cuba. After years of containment from the United States and other countries, Cuba was able to break the mold and put a communist government in place of one that was considered oppressive by the people. Guevara's book was a model for what could be done in other countries. So, in a sense, Guevara's legacy can live on within the contents of the book. Later, in the 1950s, Guevara set off to start revolutions in other countries. He started by going to the Congo in Africa to start a revolution, but it failed. He next set his eyes on Bolivia. This did not end so well. Guevara had arrived in Bolivia with a small group in 1966. He wanted to emulate the lessons learned in Cuba, in Bolivia, to start off. Less than a year later, every member of the group was either dead or had left Bolivia. Guevara was executed by the Bolivian government as a result of the attempted overthrowing. Guevara really wanted the book to start revolutions in other countries. He succeeded in doing so, but those revolutions may have elements that were played out in the Cuban Revolution to start off with. The United States didn't want to see any Latin American country go towards communism. If you wanted to know if Guevara wanted other countries to become communist states, you wouldn't be able to answer that question solely from reading the book. He really keeps an objective stance in his writings, that is, to train others to become guerrilla fighters, but you can definitely feel that his primary objective was to use Cuba as a model for other countries. The book did play a significant role in Latin American history, and the fighting still continues to this day in some countries. Guevara is still seen as a figure for revolutionaries, and many people can recognize his image, his face, as a symbol for standing up against oppression, far better than they can recognize his name. So to summarize the main points in this discussion, did Guevara accomplish what he wanted in writing this book? I believe so. Guevara wanted to be remembered as a revolutionary. Guevara was a person who saw change, and he was a person that had the ability to produce that change. I don't believe the influence of this book can be measured with a review or analysis of the content. The true influence can be found in the Latin American lives, villages, politics, and cultures that it transformed, even to this day. He wanted to bring the Marxist ideals of oppressiveness of a democracy to life as countries were transformed into a pure communist state. He saw the poverty and oppression of people and wanted others to be called to action.